Chapter 5. The Dark Mark. "Don't tell your mother you've been gambling," Mr. Weasley implored Fred and George as they all made their way slowly down the purple-carpeted stairs. "Don't worry, Dad," said Fred gleefully. "We've got big plans for this money. We don't want it confiscated. Mr. Weasley looked for a moment as though he was going to ask what these big plans were, but seemed to decide, upon reflection, that he didn't want to know. They were soon caught up in the crowds, now flooding out of the stadium and back to their campsites. Raucous singing was borne toward them on the night air as they retraced their steps along the lantern-lit path, and leprechauns kept shooting over their heads, cackling and waving their lanterns. When they finally reached the tents, nobody felt like sleeping at all, and given the level of noise around them, Mr. Weasley agreed that they could all have one last cup of cocoa together before turning in. They were soon arguing enjoyably about the match. Mr. Weasley got drawn into a disagreement about carping with Charlie, and it was only when Ginny fell asleep right at the tiny table and spilled hot chocolate all over the floor that Mr. Weasley called a halt to the verbal replays and insisted that everyone go to bed. Violet, Hermione, and Ginny bid their good nights to the boys and headed into the next tent, where they changed into their pajamas and fell heavily into their beds. From the other side of the campsite, they could still hear much singing and odd echoing bangs. Violet flopped onto her stomach and pressed her face into the pillow, sleepy and full of cocoa. The day had been spectacular. The match had been exciting enough for even her, whose passing interest in Quidditch only extended so far as whether or not her brother was winning. The speed of it all, the roars of the crowd, the lights of the leprechauns, the dancing of the Vila. Oh, but the Vila. It would be difficult for anyone to deny the beauty of the dancing, golden-haired women that had enchanted most of the stadium before they began hucking fireballs from their claws. That is, but Violet was uncomfortably aware that certain people didn't seem affected by them all. Hermione had barely spared the Vila a glance, while Violet and Harry had been utterly hypnotized. Only no one had given Harry any funny looks about it. Something sour and cold lodged itself in Violet's chest as she recalled the odd way Mr. Weasley had looked at her when the Vila had first appeared. She squeezed her eyes shut and nestled deeper into her pillow. Maybe she was just imagining it. Hopefully, it didn't mean anything. Violet never knew whether or not she had actually dropped off to sleep. All she knew was that, quite suddenly, Mr. Weasley was shouting, "Get up! Girls, Violet, Ginny, come on now, get up. This is urgent." Violet rolled over so quickly she flipped right out of bed and onto the floor. "What's going on?" asked Hermione from across the tent. Dimly, Violet could tell that something was wrong. The noises in the campsite had changed. The singing had stopped. She could hear screams and the sound of people running. She clambered to her feet and reached for her clothes, but Mr. Weasley, who had pulled on his jeans under his nightshirt, said, "Hurry, girls, get outside, quickly." Without dressing, Violet grabbed her wand, jammed her bare feet into her shoes, and hurried out of the tent on Ginny's heels. By the light of the few fires that were still burning, she could see people running away into the woods, fleeing something that was moving across the field toward them, something that was emitting odd flashes of light and noises like gunfire. Loud jeering, roars of laughter, and drunken yells were drifting toward them. Then came a burst of strong green light, which illuminated the scene. A crowd of wizards, tightly packed and moving together with wands pointing straight upward, was marching slowly across the field. Violet squinted at them. They didn't seem to have faces. Then she realized that their heads were hooded and their faces masked. High above them, floating along in midair, 4 struggling figures were being contorted into grotesque shapes. It was as though the masked wizards on the ground were puppeteers, and the people above them were marionettes operated by invisible strings that rose and fell from the wands into the air. 2 of the figures were very small. More wizards were joining the marching group, laughing and pointing up at the floating bodies. Tents crumpled and fell as the marching crowd swelled. Once or twice, Violet saw one of the marchers blast a tent out his way with his wand. Several caught fire. The screaming grew louder. The floating people were suddenly illuminated as they passed over a burning tent, and Violet recognized one of them, Mr. Roberts, the campsite manager. The other three looked as though they might be his wife and children. One of the marchers below flipped Mrs. Roberts upside down with his wand. Her nightdress fell down to reveal voluminous drawers, and she struggled to cover herself up as the crowd below her screeched and hooted with glee. "That's sick," said Ron, who had emerged from the tent with Harry, watching the smallest Muggle child, who had begun to spin like a top, 60 feet above the ground, his head flopping limply from side to side. "That is really sick." The flap of the boys' tent opened once more, and Bill, Charlie, and Percy emerged, fully dressed, with their sleeves rolled up and their wands out. "We're going to help the ministry," Mr. Weasley shouted over all the noise, rolling up his own sleeves. "You lot get into the woods and stick together. I'll come and fetch you when we've sorted this out." Bill, Charlie, and Percy were already sprinting away toward the oncoming marchers. Mr. Weasley tore after them. Ministry wizards were dashing from every direction toward the source of the trouble. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was coming ever closer. "Come on," said Fred, grabbing Ginny's hand and startling to pull her toward the wood. Violet, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and George followed. They all looked back as they reached the trees. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was larger than ever. They could see the ministry wizards trying to get through it to the hooded wizards in the center, but they were having great difficulty. It looked as though they were scared to perform any spell that might make the Roberts family fall. The colored lanterns that had lit the path to the stadium had been extinguished. Dark figures were blundering through the trees. Children were crying. Anxious shouts and panicked voices were reverberating around them in the cold night air. Violet felt herself being pushed hither and thither by people whose faces she could not see. Very nearby, someone let out a shout of pain. Violet stumbled on a pile of fallen leaves and fought to keep her footing. George caught her arm to help her balance and didn't let go as they continued to run. Violet could see his freckled face was white as a sheet. "Where are we going?" Ginny asked, her voice high and breathless with panic as Fred pulled her along. "Dad said he'd come and find us," Fred said. "We'll find someplace safe and wait for him." "But what if—" "But nothing, Ginny." Fred's voice was sharper than Violet had ever heard it, devoid of any of the easy cheer it was usually full of. He came to a sharp stop, breathing hard. For a moment Violet, though he might start shouting, but then he looked at Ginny and forced himself to smile. "Dad said he'd come when it's over. It'll all be all right." Ginny looked on the verge of tears, but Fred's smile seemed to have reassured her. She nodded and followed silently along. George let go of Violet's arm. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to drag you around like that. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Violet said, unconvincing even to her own ears. She couldn't stop thinking about the little boy spinning in the air, the woman struggling helplessly above the crowd. There were still screams coming back from the campsite, and people were still fleeing into the woods around them. The air was thick with fear. Violet looked back, hoping her own brother might be able to reassure her, as well only her brother wasn't standing behind her like she thought he was. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were nowhere to be seen. "Harry," Violet called. He must have fallen a few steps behind. He was only a short ways away, surely. But then why didn't he answer? "Harry," Violet called again, more urgently. "Ron," called George. Fred and Ginny stopped and turned back as well. "They were right behind us," Ginny said anxiously. "They followed us out of camp, didn't they?" "I'm going back," Violet said, and started off down the trail again. There was a scrambling sound behind her, and George caught her by the shoulder. "Hold on," Dad said to stick together. He said, "You can't just run off," and Violet shook free of his grasp. "I'm going to find Harry," she said, and kept walking. "Violet, wait. Bloody hell. Stay with Ginny, we'll catch up." "Oi, don't you go disappearing too," Fred said. "Good luck getting rid of me," said George over his shoulder, jogging to catch up with Violet's brisk stride. The two of them fell into step as they struggled back down the path. It was packed with plenty of other people, all heading in the opposite direction and looking nervously over their shoulders. Violet scanned every face that passed her, looking for Ron's red hair or Hermione's buck teeth, or her own reflection mirrored in Harry's face, but everyone was a stranger. Her heart leapt at the sight of a huddle of teenagers in pajamas, arguing quietly with one another. When they saw Violet and George, a girl with thick curly hair turned and said quickly, "Où est Madame Maxime? Nous l'avons perdu." "W what?" said Violet. "Oh." The girl who had spoken started to turn away. "Wait," Violet said. "Have you seen a boy who looks like me? Dark hair, only he's got glasses and a scar." The girl looked at her, uncomprehending, and turned away again. As Violet and George moved on, they distinctly heard her say, "Hogwarts." "They're not from our school," George muttered, peering over his shoulder at the group. "S'pose people have come from all over for the cup." "I'll bet they weren't expecting anything like this," said Violet. "No one was expecting anything like this," George said grimly. "This sort of stuff's not meant to happen anymore. Marches and muggle hunts, I thought the ministry put a stop to all that." "What do you mean, anymore? When did it used to happen?" "Back when you know who was in power," said George quietly. "Dad's talked about it a couple of times, but Mum always put a stop to it. She didn't want us hearing about any of that, especially Ginny, Mrs. Weasley was very protective of her youngest child and only daughter, and after what had happened to Ginny at Hogwarts 2 years earlier, Violet had no trouble believing that Mrs. Weasley would be very careful about keeping her out of harm's way. With no sign of Harry on the path they'd already taken, and the loud bangs and jeering laughter that got ever louder as they neared the edge of the forest, Violet and George veered back and headed into the trees. They followed another dark path deeper into the woods, still keeping an eye out for Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They passed a group of goblins who were cackling over a sack of gold that they had undoubtedly won betting on the match, and who seemed quite unperturbed by the trouble at the campsite. Violet elected not to ask if they had seen her brother. Something about the goblins' sharp teeth and unnaturally long fingers had always made her uneasy. With no sign of Harry and no sense of direction to guide her in the dark, Violet was rapidly settling into a state of panic. Her eyes ached from the weight of the tears building in them, just waiting for the right provocation to fall, and the rest of her body was starting to feel jerky and numb. When they reached a small clearing, Violet stopped and looked around, peering through the dark trees as though she might catch a familiar sight: the glint of Harry's glasses or the silhouette of his baggy, hand-me-down clothes. But the few shapes she saw moving through the forest were distant and unfamiliar, too tall, too fat, too large of a group. None of them were Harry. "Blimey, you must be freezing," George said suddenly, and Violet looked at him in confusion. "What? You're shaking like mad," he pointed out. "You should have said something." Here, George struggled out of his jumper, revealing a t-shirt underneath. He held it out to Violet. "Put this on. You need it more than I do." Violet, now painfully aware of the shivers racking her body, looked down in mortification at the vest top and shorts she was wearing. She hadn't been able to grab any clothes besides her shoes when Mr. Weasley woke them up. George pushed the jumper into her frozen hands. But won't you get cold too?" Violet asked. He shrugged. "I mean, we can take turns if you're really worried about it," he teased. Violet was grateful that the dark covered her blush. She pulled the sweater on over her head. It was much too large, and though she couldn't make out the color, she could see a large letter G knitted into the front. The sleeves fell down to cover her hands, and Violet tried not to think about how warm it already was. "Thanks," she muttered to George. He smiled, and it might have just been Violet's imagination, but she thought he might be blushing a bit as well. "Don't mention it. Mum makes us new ones every SHH, Violet hissed, whipping around. She had just heard a noise, a voice in the distance that sounded very familiar. She listened carefully. There was another shout, coming from somewhere behind them. Violet looked quickly at George, confirming that he had heard it too, and he nodded silently. Without another word, Violet turned and raced in the direction of the voice. "Violet, wait!" "That sounded like Harry," Violet hissed, staggering blindly through the trees. I know it's him, just like you'd know if it was Fred. He's close, I can feel it. Without warning, the silence was rent by a voice unlike any they had heard in the wood. Not a scream or a panicked shout, but what sounded like a spell. Morsemorder. A flash of green erupted through the trees ahead of them, and something vast and glittering flew up over the treetops and into the sky. What the? Gasped George, staggering back as he stared up at the thing that had appeared. For a split second, Violet thought it was another leprechaun formation. Then she realized that was it, a colossal skull, comprised of what looked like smoke and emerald stars, with a serpent protruding from its mouth like a tongue. As they watched, it rose higher and higher, blazing in a haze of greenish smoke, etched against the black sky like a new constellation. Suddenly, the wood all around them erupted with screaming. Violet understood why. The skull had now risen high enough to illuminate the entire wood like some grisly neon sign. It was an image that she had only seen in faded old copies of Thedely Prophet in the Hogwarts library, but Violet knew exactly what it was. The Dark Mark. Voldemort's sign, left behind by his followers where a killing had taken place. Harry! Violet screamed, rushing forward. No! George cried, catching hold of the back of her jumper, but Violet twisted away and kept going. Harry! Harry, where are Violet? Called Harry's voice, just through the trees again. Lit up by the light of the terrible skull, Violet could see a clearing ahead. She raced toward it, stumbling, and then stupefy, roared a chorus of voices, and a wave of fiery red jets shot through the trees. Two of them hit Violet in the chest, and down she went. It was as though a very thick fog had enveloped her head. Thoroughly dazed, Violet was only vaguely aware of someone standing over her and shouting, and then of being dragged limply across the ground. There was more shouting, louder, and from several people. She couldn't get her eyes to focus. Couldn't have been her, said a voice, oddly familiar, from somewhere over Violet's head. The words sounded as though they were traveling through water to reach her. Think of who you're talking about. And the boy, said a different voice, less familiar but sharper. Violet squeezed her eyes shut, desperate to stop the pounding in her head, which was very sore. Her was very sore now that she thought about it. They're wands, said yet another voice, the clearest yet, and a woman. Here, Amos, check them. Something was muttered overhead. A soft white glow washed over Violet's face. She groaned, pained by the brightness, and tried to turn her head away. For goodness sake, let her up, said the first, familiar voice again, followed by, renovate. All at once the heaviness of Violet's head and body disappeared. She was very sore and very cold, and she was lying on the ground, and when she opened her eyes it was to see Mr. Weasley kneeling over her and looking deeply concerned. Violet, he said, peering down at her. Violet, can you hear me? What happened? Violet groaned, trying to sit up. Mr. Weasley helped her pull herself into a sitting position. She rubbed at her eyes and looked around. She was sitting in the middle of a circle of about 20 ministry wizards. Mr. Crouch was standing behind Mr. Weasley, and Amos Diggory was holding her wand. Violet turned her head to the left and saw Harry, Ron, and Hermione staring down at her as well. Are you all right? Harry asked, looking very relieved to see her sitting up. He likely would have been on the ground at her side as well, if not for the burly ministry wizard holding on to his shoulder. Violet nodded, then immediately winced. The back of her head felt like it had been hit with a bludger. Where's George? She mumbled, looking around again. Present and accounted for, said George's voice from behind her, sounding pained, and Violet turned to see him standing in between two grim-looking wizards, each with a firm hand on his shoulders. There was a leaf in his hair and dirt on the front of his shirt and face. He looked as though he had been tackled to the ground. Violet, I need to ask you some questions, please, said Mr. Weasley urgently, drawing Violet's attention back to him. Did you see anyone in the woods? Did you see the person who conjured the mark in the sky? Violet shook her head and regretted it as her brain wobbled like a bowl of custard. We heard voices, she said, coming from ahead. I thought I heard Harry, so I ran towards it. Then somebody shouted, and that thing flew up from the trees. but I never saw anybody. You ran toward Harry, Mr. Weasley asked. You weren't together. We got separated, Violet told him. Mr. Weasley looked sharply at his older son. Where's your sister? He demanded. With Fred, George said. They went on ahead, and you just ran off and left them. George, I told you to stick together. Well, I wasn't going to let Violet go off by herself, George countered. It's my fault, Violet said quickly. I wanted to go find Harry. George tried to stop me, but I didn't listen, so he came with. I'm sorry. I know we were supposed to stay together, but I couldn't find Harry, and I was scared. I'm sorry. Mr. Weasley's expression softened at once. It's all right, Violet, I understand. I don't know how you all wound up separated in the first place, but at least, Mr. Weasley was interrupted by a shout from the trees. We found another one. There's someone here, unconscious. It's but blimey, bring them here, shouted Mr. Diggory. Who is it? They heard snapping twigs, the rustling of leaves, and then crunching footsteps as a witch in a woolen dressing gown emerged from behind the trees. She was carrying a tiny, limp figure in her arms. Violet recognized the tea towel at once. It was Winky. Mr. Crouch did not move or speak as the witch deposited his elf at his feet on the ground, only a few feet from where Violet sat. The other ministry wizards were all staring at Mr. Crouch. For a few seconds Crouch remained transfixed, his eyes blazing in his white face as he stared down at Winky. Then he appeared to come to life again. This cannot be, he said jerkily. No, he moved quickly around the ministry witch and strode off toward the place where she had found Winky. They could hear him moving around and the rustling of leaves as he pushed the bushes aside, searching. Bit embarrassing, Mr. Diggory said grimly, looking down at Winky's unconscious form. Barty Crouch's house elf, I mean to say. Come off it, Amos, said Mr. Weasley quietly. You don't seriously think it was the elf? The dark mark's a wizard's sign. It requires a wand. Was anyone else with it? Mr. Diggory asked the witch, who shook her head. No one, Amos, only she had this. The woman held up a wand and showed it to Diggory and Mr. Weasley. She had it in her hands. So that's Class 3 of the Code of Wand Use broken, for a start, said Mr. Diggory, staring unpleasantly down at Winky. No non-human creature is permitted to carry or use a wand. Just then, there was another pop, and Ludo Bagman apparated right next to Mr. Weasley. Looking breathless and disoriented, he spun on the spot, gargling upward at the emerald green skull. The dark mark, he panted, almost trampling Violet as he turned inquiringly to his colleagues. Who did it? Did you get them? Barty, what's going on? Mr. Crouch had returned empty-handed. His face was still ghostly white, and his hands and his toothbrush mustache were both twitching. Where have you been, Barty? Said Bagman. Why weren't you at the match? Your elf was saving you a seat too, gulping gargoyles. Bagman had just noticed Violet on the ground and Winky lying beside her. What happened to them? I have been busy, Ludo, said Mr. Crouch, still talking in the same jerky fashion, barely moving his lips. And my elf has been stunned. Stunned? By you lot, you mean? But why? Comprehension dawned suddenly on Bagman's round, shiny face. He looked up at the skull, down at Winky, and then at Mr. Crouch. No, he said. Winky, conjure the dark mark. She wouldn't know how. She'd need a wand for a start. And she had one, said Mr. Diggory, taking the wand and holding it up for all to see. She was found holding one, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself. Out of the way, love, if you don't mind. Violet scrambled painfully to her feet with Mr. Weasley's help and was shuffled over to George's side. Mr. Diggory moved to stand over Winky. He raised his own wand, pointed it at Winky, and said, Renovate. Winky stirred feebly. Her great brown eyes opened, and she blinked several times in a bemused sort of way. Watched by the silent wizards, she raised herself shakily into a sitting position. She caught sight of Mr. Diggory's feet, and slowly, tremulously, raised her eyes to stare up into his face. Then, more slowly still, she looked up into the sky. Violet could see the floating skull reflected twice in her enormous, glassy eyes. She gave a gasp, looked wildly around the crowded clearing and burst into terrified sobs. "Elf," said Mr. Diggory sternly, "do you know who I am?" "I'm a member of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Winky began to rock backward and forward on the ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Violet was reminded forcibly of some of her own darkest moments spent in that exact same state, locked in the cupboard underneath the Dursley stairs. "As you see, Elf, the dark mark was conjured here a short while ago," said Mr. Diggory, "and you were discovered, minutes later, right beneath it. An explanation, if you please." I is not doing it, sir," Winky gasped. "I is not knowing how, sir." "You were found with a wand in your hand," barked Mr. Diggory, brandishing it in front of her. "Hey," said Harry suddenly, "that's mine." Everyone in the clearing looked at him. "Excuse me," said Mr. Diggory incredulously. "That's my wand," said Harry. "I dropped it." "You dropped it," repeated Mr. Diggory in disbelief. "Is this a confession? You threw it aside after you conjured the mark." "Amos, for Merlin's sake," said Mr. Weasley very angrily. "First one Potter, now the other. Do you really think either of them likely to conjure the dark mark?" Of course not," mumbled Mr. Diggory. "Sorry, carried away." "I didn't drop it there anyway," said Harry, jerking his thumb toward the trees beneath the skull. "I missed it right after we got into the wood." "So," said Mr. Diggory, his eyes hardening as he turned to look at Winky again, cowering at his feet. "You found this wand, Elf, and you picked it up and thought you'd have some fun with it, did you?" Violet decided she didn't like Mr. Diggory at all. "I is not doing magic with it, sir," squealed Winky, tears streaming down the sides of her squashed and bulbous nose. I is just picking it up, sir. I is not making the dark mark, sir. I is not knowing how." "It wasn't her," said Hermione. She looked very nervous, speaking up in front of all these ministry wizards, yet determined all the same. "Winky's got a squeaky little voice, and the voice we heard doing the incantation was much deeper." She looked around at Harry and Ron, clearly appealing for their support. "It didn't sound anything like Winky, did it?" "It sounded like a man," said Violet at once. "Yeah, it was a human voice," said Ron. "Well, we'll soon see," growled Mr. Diggory, looking unimpressed. "There's a simple way of discovering the last spell a wand performed, Elf. Did you know that?" Winky trembled and shook her head frantically, her ears flapping, as Mr. Diggory raised his own wand again and placed it tip to tip with Harry's. "Prior incantato," roared Mr. Diggory. Several wizards gasped, horrified, as a gigantic serpent-tongued skull erupted from the point where the two wands met, but it was a mere shadow of the green skull high above them. It looked as though it were made of thick grey smoke, the ghost of a spell. "Deletrious," said Mr. Diggory, and the smoky skull vanished in a wisp of smoke. "So," said Mr. Diggory with a kind of savage triumph, looking down upon Winky, who was still shaking convulsively. "I is not doing it," she squealed, her eyes rolling in terror. I is not knowing how. I is a good elf, I isn't using wands, I isn't knowing how." "You've been caught red-handed, Elf," Mr. Diggory roared, "caught with the guilty wand in your hand." "Amos," said Mr. Weasley loudly, "think about it. Precious few wizards know how to do that spell." "Where would she have learned it? Perhaps Amos is suggesting," said Mr. Crouch, cold anger in every syllable, "that I routinely teach my servants to conjure the dark mark." There was a deeply unpleasant silence. Amos Diggory looked horrified. "Mr. Crouch, not at all. You have now come very close to accusing the people in this clearing who are least likely to conjure that mark," barked Mr. Crouch. "The Potter twins and myself. I suppose you are familiar with the children's story, Amos." "Of course, everyone knows," muttered Mr. Diggory, looking highly discomforted. "And I trust you remember the many proofs I have given over a long career that I despise and detest the dark arts and those who practice them," Mr. Crouch shouted, his eyes bulging again. "Mr. Crouch, I never suggested you had anything to do with it," Amos Diggory muttered again, now reddening behind his scrubby brown beard. "If you accuse my elf, you accuse me, Diggory," shouted Mr. Crouch. Where else would she have learned to conjure it? She might have picked it up anywhere. Precisely, Amos, said Mr. Weasley. She might have picked it up anywhere. Winky, he said kindly, turning to the elf, but she flinched as though he too was shouting at her. Where exactly did you find Harry's wand? Winky was twisting the hem of her tea towel so violently that it was fraying beneath her fingers. I is finding it. Finding it there, sir. She whispered. There, in the trees, sir. You see, Amos, said Mr. Weasley. Whoever conjured the mark could have disapparated right after they'd done it, leaving Harry's wand behind. A clever thing to do, not using their own wand, which could have betrayed them. And Winky here had the misfortune to come across the wand moments later and pick it up. But then she'd have been only a few feet away from the real culprit, said Mr. Diggory impatiently. Elf, did you see anyone? Winky began to tremble worse than ever. Her giant eyes flickered from Mr. Diggory to Ludo Bagman and on to Mr. Crouch. Then she gulped and said, I is seeing no one, sir. No one. Amos, said Mr. Crouch curtly, I am fully aware that, in the ordinary course of events, you would want to take Winky into your department for questioning. I ask you, however, to allow me to deal with her. Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of this suggestion at all, but it was clear to Violet that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the ministry that he did not dare refuse him. You may rest assured that she will be punished, Mr. Crouch added coldly. Master, Winky stammered, looking up at Mr. Crouch, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, PP please. Mr. Crouch stepped back, his face somehow sharpened, each line upon it more deeply etched. There was no pity in his gaze. Winky has behaved tonight in a manner I would not have believed possible, he said slowly. I told her to remain in the tent. I told her to stay there while I went to sort out the trouble, and I find that she disobeyed me. This means clothes. No, shrieked Winky, prostrating herself at Mr. Crouch's feet. No, master, not clothes, not clothes. Violet knew from Harry that the only way to turn a house elf free was to present it with proper garments. It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. But she was frightened. Hermione burst out angrily, glaring at Mr. Crouch. Your elf's scared of heights, and those wizards in masks were levitating people. You can't blame her for wanting to get out of their way. Mr. Crouch took a step backward, freeing himself from contact with the elf, whom he was surveying as though she were something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. I have no use for a house elf who disobeys me, he said coldly, looking over at Hermione. I have no use for a servant who forgets what is due to her master and to her master's reputation. Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing. There was a very nasty silence, which was ended by Mr. Weasley, who said quietly, Well, I think I'll take my lot back to the tent if nobody's got any objections. Amos, that wand's told us all it can if Harry could have it back, please. Mr. Diggory handed Harry his wand, and Harry pocketed it. Come on, you lot, Mr. Weasley said quietly. The boys shuffled over to him, but Violet and Hermione stayed put. Their eyes were still upon the sobbing elf. Girls, Mr. Weasley said more urgently. Hermione turned and followed Harry, Ron, and George out of the clearing, but it took a moment longer for Violet to tear her gaze from the pitiful creature on the ground. Mr. Weasley wrapped an arm around her shoulders as soon as she was in reach and hurried her along. What's going to happen to Winky? Said Hermione the moment they had left the clearing. I don't know, said Mr. Weasley. We should have helped her, Violet said, shaking in a way that had little to do with the cold. Mr. Weasley's arm tightened around her. There's nothing any of us could have done for her, Violet, he muttered uncomfortably. The way they were treating her, said Hermione furiously. Mr. Diggory calling her elf all the time, and Mr. Crouch. He knows she didn't do it, and he's still going to sack her. He didn't care how frightened she'd been, or how upset she was. It was like she wasn't even human. Well, she's not, said Ron. Hermione rounded on him. That doesn't mean she hasn't got feelings. Ron, it's disgusting the way. Hermione, I agree with you, said Mr. Weasley quickly, beckoning her on, but now is not the time to discuss elf rights. I want to get back to the tent as fast as we can. George, you said Fred and Ginny went on ahead. Fred said he'd look out for you, said George quietly. He'll have taken care of her, Dad, don't worry. It's my job to worry, Mr. Weasley muttered. And you three, he said to Ron, Harry, and Hermione, how did you end up on your own? We got separated in the dark, said Ron. Dad, why was everyone so uptight about that skull thing? I'll explain everything back at the tent, said Mr. Weasley tensely. But when they reached the edge of the wood, their progress was impeded. A large crowd of frightened-looking witches and wizards was congregated there, and when they saw Mr. Weasley coming toward them, many of them surged forward. What's going on in there? Who conjured it? Arthur, it's not him. Of course it's not him, said Mr. Weasley impatiently. We don't know who it was. It looks like they disapparated. Now excuse me, please. I want to get to bed. He led the 5 of them through the crowd and back into the campsite. All was quiet now. There was no sign of the masked wizards, though several ruined tents were still smoking. Charlie's head was poking out of the boys' tent. Dad, what's going on? He called through the dark. Fred and Ginny got back okay, but all the others, I've got them here, said Mr. Weasley, bending down and entering the tent. The rest of them filed in after him. Bill was sitting at the small kitchen table, holding a bedsheet to his arm, which was bleeding profusely. Charlie had a large rip in his shirt, and Percy was sporting a bloody nose. Fred and Ginny looked unhurt, though shaken. Did you get them, Dad? Said Bill sharply. The person who conjured the mark. No, said Mr. Weasley. We found Barty Crouch's elf holding Harry's wand, but we're none the wiser about who actually conjured the mark. What? Said Bill, Charlie, and Percy together. Harry's wand, said Fred. Mr. Crouch's elf, said Percy, sounding thunderstruck. With some assistance from those who had also been there, Mr. Weasley explained what had happened in the wood. When they had finished their story, Percy swelled indignantly. Well, Mr. Crouch is quite right to get rid of an elf like that, he said. Running away when he'd expressly told her not to, embarrassing him in front of the whole ministry. How would that have looked if she'd been brought up in front of the Department for the Regulation and Control? She didn't do anything, she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hermione snapped at Percy, who looked very taken aback. Hermione had always got on fairly well with Percy, better, indeed, than any of the others. Hermione, a wizard in Mr. Crouch's position, can't afford a house elf who's going to run amok with a wand, said Percy pompously, recovering himself. She didn't run amok, shouted Hermione. She just picked it up off the ground. Look, can someone just explain what that skull thing was? Said Ron impatiently. It wasn't hurting anyone. Why's it such a big deal? I told you, it's you-know-whose symbol, Ron, said Hermione, before anyone else could answer. I read about it in The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, and it hasn't been seen for 13 years, said Mr. Weasley quietly. Of course people panicked. It was almost like seeing you-know-who back again. I don't get it, said Ron, frowning. I mean, it's still only a shape in the sky. It's what Voldemort's followers put up in the sky whenever they killed, Violet said softly, and everyone in the room flinched before turning to stare at her. Mr. Weasley's mouth was hanging open. Violet, how do you know about that? He asked weakly. Violet gave a one-shouldered shrug. Hermione's not the only one who reads, sir. Mr. Weasley closed his mouth. He rubbed a trembling hand over his forehead. Yes, well, Violet is right. That is exactly what the dark mark was used for, the terror it inspired. You have no idea, you're too young. Just picture coming home and finding the dark mark hovering over your house and knowing what you're about to find inside. Mr. Weasley winced. Everyone's worst fear. The very worst. There was silence for a moment. Then Bill, removing the sheet from his arm to check on his cut, said, Well, it didn't help them tonight, whoever conjured it. It scared the Death Eaters away the moment they saw it. They all disapparated before we got near enough to unmask any of them. We caught the Robertses before they hit the ground, though. They're having their memories modified right now. Death Eaters, said Harry. What are Death Eaters? It's what you-know-who's supporters called themselves, said Bill. I think we saw what's left of them tonight, the ones who managed to keep themselves out of Azkaban anyway. We can't prove it was them, Bill, said Mr. Weasley. Though it probably was, he added hopelessly. Yeah, I bet it was, said Ron suddenly. Dad, we met Draco Malfoy in the woods, and he as good as told us his dad was one of those nutters in masks. And we all know the Malfoys were right in with you-know-who. But what were Voldemort's supporters? Harry began, and everyone flinched again. Like most of the wizarding world, the Weasleys always avoided saying Voldemort's name. Sorry, said Harry quickly. What were you-know-who's supporters up to, levitating muggles? I mean, what's the point? The point, said Mr. Weasley with a hollow laugh. Harry, that's their idea of fun. Half the muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. I suppose they had a few drinks tonight and couldn't resist reminding us that lots of them are still at large. A nice little reunion for them, he finished disgustedly. But if they were a Death Eaters, why did they disapparate when they saw the dark mark? Said Ron. They'd have been pleased to see it, wouldn't they? Use your brains, Ron, said Bill. If they really were Death Eaters, they worked very hard to keep out of Azkaban when you-know-who lost power, and told all sorts of lies about him, forcing them to kill and torture people. I bet they'd be even more frightened than the rest of us to see him come back. They denied they'd ever been involved with him when he lost his powers and went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be overpleased with them, do you? So, whoever conjured the dark mark, said Hermione slowly, were they doing it to show support for the Death Eaters or to scare them away? Your guess is as good as ours, Hermione, said Mr. Weasley. But I'll tell you this. It was only the Death Eaters who ever knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who did it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even if they're not now. How do you stop being a Death Eater? Violet demanded. Do they just say, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean any of it, and get a free pass? After everything they did in Voldemort's name, Mr. Weasley flinched worst of all this time. It isn't right, Violet, I know. There have been debates within the ministry about it for years, whether or not it's too late to hold anyone accountable. Listen, it's very late, he turned to his children, and if your mother hears what's happened, she'll be worried sick. We'll get a few more hours of sleep, and then try and get an early portkey out of here. As the girls headed back to their own tent, Violet suddenly remembered that she was still wearing George's sweater. She pulled it over her head and walked over to him. Here's this back, she said, holding the jumper out toward him. Oh, thanks, said George, taking it with a look of surprise. Did you stay warm, at least? Yeah, said Violet. I did. It helped, George grinned. Good, he said, immediately pulling the jumper over his own head, because it's my turn now, and I'm bloody freezing. Violet entered the girls' tent, smiling despite herself and all the terror that had happened tonight. The smile faded, however, when she saw Ginny and Hermione sitting up in their beds, both looking wide awake and very worried. I don't know if I can sleep, Hermione said quietly. I keep thinking about poor Winky. She turned her head away and wiped at her eyes. Ginny was sitting with her arms tightly wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. Violet was struck with an idea. Here, help me with the beds, she said, yanking the covers off of her own bed and pulling the thin mattress onto the ground while Ginny and Hermione looked on in confusion. Come on, we'll pile up on the floor tonight. It'll be warmer that way. After a few minutes of arranging pillows and blankets, the three of them were settled into a sort of nest in the middle of the floor, all three beds stripped of their mattresses and linens. Like pigs in a blanket, they lay side by side with little Ginny in the middle. Is this okay? Violet asked, noticing the way Hermione was trying to keep to the edges of the nest. It's fine, Hermione said quickly. She paused. I've never had a sleepover before. Why not? Said Ginny. Hermione's face reddened. Nobody's ever invited me to one, she muttered. I've never really had friends like this before, even in primary school and then with Harry and Ron. Well, they sleep in their dorm and I stay in mine. Harry and I have always slept together, Violet said quietly, looking at the other girls in the dark. We've only had the one bed to share, so we had to, I suppose. I used to always crawl into my brother's beds when I was little, Ginny said, her voice slightly muffled by the blankets. They'd take turns, you know. Who's looking after Ginny tonight? Then Mum said I was being childish and started making me stay in my own room at night. Her brown eyes flicked to Violet's over the hem of the quilt. Was it hard for you and Harry coming to Hogwarts and being separated? At first, yeah, said Violet. We'd never been apart like that before, ever, and everything about Hogwarts was so new and scary. But it's been easier as we get older. Now we have to get used to sharing a bed again during the summers instead of getting used to sleeping on our own. Violet hesitated for a moment. I still like this better, though, she said finally. Sleeping with somebody else, it just feels, I dunno. Safer. The three of them were quiet for a long time. The tent was silent except for the sounds of their own soft breathing, and Violet was sure at least one of them must have fallen asleep. But then Hermione said softly, I do feel safe now. More than I think I would if we were all spread out. Thank you, Violet. For what? For inviting me to a sleepover, said Hermione. She, Violet, and Ginny all giggled together, bundled up amongst the pillows and blankets from all of their beds. It was a strangely buoyant moment, brief levity in the midst of the night's chaos and panic. Warmth spread through Violet's limbs and into her head, lulling her into a soft, easy, dreamless sleep. Chapter 6. Mayhem at the Ministry. Mr. Weasley woke them after only a few hours of sleep. While he seemed surprised to find Violet, Ginny, and Hermione all bundled up together on the floor, he made no comment beyond asking if they slept well. He used magic to pack up the tents, and then they left the campsite as quickly as possible, passing Mr. Roberts at the door of his cottage. Mr. Roberts had a strange, dazed look about him, and he waved them off with a vague, happy Christmas. He'll be all right, said Mr. Weasley quietly as they marched off onto the moor. Sometimes, when a person's memory's modified, it makes them a bit disoriented for a while, and that was a big thing they had to make him forget. They heard urgent voices as they approached the spot where the portkeys lay, and when they reached it, they found a great number of witches and wizards gathered around Basil, the keeper of the portkeys, all clamoring to get away from the campsite as fast as they could. Mr. Weasley had a hurried discussion with Basil. They joined the queue and were able to take an old rubber tire back to Stoatshead Hill before the sun had really risen. They walked back through Ottery St. Catchpole and up the damp lane toward the burrow in the dawn light, talking very little because they were so exhausted and thinking longingly of their breakfast. As they rounded the corner and the burrow came into view, a cry echoed along the lane. Oh, thank goodness, Mrs. Weasley, who had evidently been waiting for them in the front yard, came running toward them, still wearing her bedroom slippers, her face pale and strained, a rolled-up copy of Thedley Prophet clutched in her hand. Arthur, I've been so worried, so worried. She flung her arms around Mr. Weasley's neck, and Thedley Prophet fell out of her hand onto the ground. Looking down, Violet saw the headline, Scenes of Terror at the Quidditch World Cup, complete with a twinkling black and white photograph of the dark mark over the treetops. You're all right, Mrs. Weasley muttered distractedly, releasing Mr. Weasley and staring around at them all with red eyes. You're alive. Oh, boys. And to everybody's surprise, she seized Fred and George and pulled them both into such a tight hug that their heads banged together. Ouch. Mum, you're strangling us. I shouted at you before you left, Mrs. Weasley said, starting to sob. It's all I've been thinking about. What if you know who had got you, and the last thing I ever said to you was that you didn't get enough OWLS? Oh, Fred, George. Come on now, Marley, we're all perfectly okay, said Mr. Weasley soothingly, prizing her off the twins and leading her back toward the house. Bill, he added in an undertone, pick up that paper. I want to see what it says. When they were all crammed into the tiny kitchen, and Hermione had made Mrs. Weasley a cup of very strong tea, into which Mr. Weasley insisted on pouring a shot of Ogden's old fire whiskey, Bill handed his father the newspaper. Mr. Weasley scanned the front page while Percy looked over his shoulder. I knew it, said Mr. Weasley heavily. Ministry blunders. Culprits not apprehended. Lack security. Dark wizards running unchecked. National disgrace. Who wrote this? Ah, of course. Rita Skeeter. That woman's got it in for the Ministry of Magica, said Percy furiously. Last week she was saying we're wasting our time quibbling about cauldron thickness when we should be stamping out vampires. As if it wasn't specifically stated in paragraph 12 of the guidelines for the treatment of non-wizard part humans. Do us a favor, Percy, said Bill, yawning, and shut up. I'm mentioned, said Mr. Weasley, his eyes widening behind his glasses as he reached the bottom of Thedley Prophet article. Where? Spluttered Mrs. Weasley, choking on her tea and whiskey. If I'd seen that, I'd have known you were alive. Not by name, said Mr. Weasley. Listen to this. If the terrified wizards and witches who waited breathlessly for news at the edge of the wood expected reassurance from the Ministry of Magic, they were sadly disappointed. A ministry official emerged some time after the appearance of the Dark Mark, alleging that nobody had been hurt, but refusing to give any more information. Whether this statement will be enough to quash the rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods an hour later remains to be seen. Oh, really? Said Mr. Weasley, handing the paper to Percy. Nabadewashirt. What was I supposed to say? Rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods. Well, there certainly will be rumors now she's printed that. He heaved a deep sigh. Marley, I'm going to have to go into the office. This is going to take some smoothing over. I'll come with you, father, said Percy importantly. Mr. Crouch will need all hands on deck, and I can give him my cauldron report in person. He bustled out of the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley looked most upset. Arthur, you're supposed to be on holiday. This hasn't got anything to do with your office. Surely they can handle this without you. I've got to go, Marley, said Mr. Weasley. I've made things worse. I'll just change into my robes and I'll be off. Mrs. Weasley, said Harry suddenly, Hedwig hasn't arrived with a letter for me, has she? Hedwig, dear, said Mrs. Weasley distractedly. No, there hasn't been any post at all. Harry looked out for a moment, then looked meaningfully at Ron and Hermione and said, All right if I go dump my stuff in your room, Ron. Yeah, think I will too, said Ron at once. Hermione. Yes, she said quickly, and the three of them marched out of the kitchen and up the stairs. Violet rolled her eyes. Honestly, she muttered, they could just say they wanted to speak in private. She sank heavily into a chair at the kitchen table, unsure what to do as all the Weasleys slowly ambled off to other parts of the house. Violet was about to offer to help with breakfast when a flicker caught her eye from across the table. Percy had left the prophet laying open, and a familiar face was looking out at her in black and white from the creased pages. Harry's godfather, Sirius Black. Violet leaned across the table and pulled the paper in front of herself, smoothing it out to see the article. The Sirius in the photograph was very different from the Sirius that Violet had last seen in person. Gone were the thick mats of filthy hair. His face was no longer waxy and sunken, while still very thin. It looked as though he'd had a few square meals over the last month. He was not, however, smiling. The photo of Sirius looked rather annoyed, like it didn't actually want to be in front of the camera at all, but had no choice. Violet scanned the title, Black's Acquittal a Slippery Slope, before dropping her eyes and quickly scanning the article. The author seemed to think that Sirius' escape and subsequent release from Azkaban had something to do with the masked march at the Quidditch World Cup, and even proposed that more convicted murderers might soon be acquitted and put back into the streets of the wizarding world. This was ridiculous, because Sirius wasn't a murderer and wasn't ever a supporter of Voldemort. Logically, Violet could understand how it looked to someone who had grown up hearing stories of the horrendous crimes Sirius had supposedly committed. Killing 13 people with a single curse was a terrifying feat, enough to earn him infamy even before he became the first person to ever escape from Azkaban. And now, months later, supporters of Lord Voldemort were marching openly and terrorizing muggles from behind their masks. If this was truly like the old days, as Mr. Weasley said, it made perfect sense for people to be suspicious and afraid. But it wasn't Sirius they should be worried about. Peter Pettigrew was the true culprit of all the crimes Sirius had been imprisoned for, and though enough witnesses had seen him to confirm that he was in fact alive, he had managed to avoid being taken into ministry custody. Pettigrew was still out there as far as anyone knew. He could have been searching for his old master right that moment. It was a frightening, worrying thought, and Violet had had enough of being frightened and worried for one day. She closed the newspaper and pushed it back across the table, and was getting to her feet when she heard a sharp rapping at the window. Violet looked up and saw a large white owl perched on the sill, staring expectantly in at her. Hedwig had returned. Violet rushed to open the window and let Hedwig in. She had 2 letters tied to her leg, and Violet made sure to stroke her head affectionately before reaching for them. "Harry's upstairs," she told the owl idly, turning the letters over in her hands. One was addressed specifically to Harry and was almost certainly from Sirius, and the other had both their names written on the envelope, in writing that Violet recognized as belonging to her own godfather, Remus Lupin. She opened the letter at once and unfurled it to read. "Harry, Violet, thank you for keeping me informed. Glad to hear the 2 of you are with the Weasleys. Hope you've enjoyed your summer. I heard about what happened at the Quidditch Cup. I dearly hope that the both of you are safe. Please come see me as soon as possible when you arrive at school. My new office is on the 3rd floor near a very useful statue. Professor R.J. Lupin." It was a very rushed letter, and Violet was almost certain that the word professor had been added as an afterthought, judging by its cramped placement. Glad as she was to hear from Professor Lupin at all, it was disappointing that the message was so brief. Violet folded the letter, stuffed it back in its envelope, and went to look for Harry. She found him exactly where she expected, in Ron's bedroom with Ron and Hermione, huddled together and whispering quietly. "Bloody hell," said Ron, jumping to his feet as Violet flung open the door. "Haven't you heard of knocking?" "No," Violet said flatly. She held the letters out toward Harry. "Hedwig's back." She brought letters from Remus and Sirius. "Don't you mean Professor Lupin?" Hermione said, frowning, as Harry scrambled to his feet and snatched the letters out of Violet's grasp. "He's more than a professor to me, though," Violet said. Hermione still looked unconvinced, but thankfully left the matter alone. "This one's been opened," Harry said suddenly, holding up the letter from Remus in suspicion. Violet rolled her eyes. "Yeah, it has by me. I read it in the kitchen." "Oh," Harry frowned. He read quickly over the short letter. "Says he wants us to come see him, near a very useful statue, on the 3rd floor. Do you reckon he means the one-eyed witch?" "I still can't believe Dumbledore let him step down from the Defense Against the Dark Arts job," Hermione said. "He's the best teacher we've ever had, even Lockhart," Ron said quickly, grinning even as Hermione glared at him. Gilderoy Lockhart was their Defense Against the Dark Arts professor during their 2nd year at Hogwarts. He was very handsome, utterly incompetent, and had completely lost his memories at the end of the year due to a backfired spell. Once, Hermione had been quite taken with him. "I'm quite interested in this new subject of his, however," Hermione continued loudly, ignoring Ron's jibe. "Beings and beasts sounds like a fascinating topic. I just hope I'll have time for it this year." Violet and Hermione shared a sly, knowing glance. Hermione had had plenty of time for her extra lessons last year, thanks to the use to a time turner. The little golden hourglass was instrumental in saving Sirius' life, too, but Hermione had given it back at the end of the year, for reasons that Violet couldn't entirely fathom. "Sirius's trial is being moved up," Harry said suddenly. Violet, Ron, and Hermione all looked at him. "Only by a few days," he said, reading from the parchment in his hands, "but Sirius says he pushed to have it as soon as possible. He says he might be able to visit us in Hogsmeade." "That's brilliant," said Violet, her face splitting into a grin to match her brother's. When's the trial? Harry looked back down at the letter and said, The 3rd, that's only a few days away. If only it had been sooner, we might have gotten to see him before going to school. You'll be lucky to see him at all, no matter when, said Hermione. Harry frowned at her. What's that supposed to mean? I've been reading about the justice system in the wizarding world, Hermione said, not looking at him. When I learned that Sirius hadn't been given a trial the first time around, I decided to look into it. Unfortunately, there's a precedent for that sort of thing in the wizarding courts. The fact that he's given a fair trial is more surprising than the way he was treated before. But they'll have to let him go, said Ron passionately. After what we heard, and seeing Pettigrew Dumbledore was there, and he's going to testify on Sirius' behalf, isn't he? There's no way they could send him back to Azkaban. I wish we could testify, said Harry. Hermione scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. Harry Sirius is going to have a hard enough time convincing the Wisengamot to believe his story without having to listen to a bunch of teenagers. They'd never take us seriously. But we were there, Ron said angrily. We're the ones who know everything that happened, not Dumbledore. He heard it all from us in the first place. And from Remus, Violet added. But he's not going to testify either. I asked him about it a few weeks ago. He wanted to, but Dumbledore convinced him not to. There'd be too many questions. He'd have to expose himself as a werewolf for sure, and then nobody would want to listen to him anyways. So why's testifying then? Ron said. Not us, and not Lupin. It's not like they can put Pettigrew himself on the stand, can they? He got away from them as well. Snape's testifying, Harry said grimly. Sirius says so in the letter. Well, then it's going to be all right. Professor Snape was actually present, so he'll be able to tell the Ministry the truth, Hermione said, though she herself didn't seem particularly convinced. She, Harry, and Ron all glanced cautiously at Violet. Normally, any time they criticized their potions, Professor Violet would speak up his in defense. He was a head of house after all, and had gone out of his way in the past to look after her. For the last 2 years, Violet had been privileged enough to receive private potions lessons from Professor Snape himself, giving her a definite edge over the rest of the class. Not that she had ever told anyone such a thing, not even Harry. But this time she remained silent. As much as Violet had looked up to Professor Snape over the years, his outburst at the end of last year had badly frightened her. Not only had he been extremely reluctant to admit Sirius' innocence, he had gone so far as to accuse him and Pettigrew of colluding together, even though he'd heard and seen the exact same evidence that everyone else had. His stubborn hatred for Sirius, to the point of wishing for his death, left an extremely bitter taste in Violet's mouth. Sirius will be released because he's innocent, Violet said, ignoring Hermione's comment about Snape entirely. As long as he's able to tell his story, the court will have to believe him, and he'll be a free man. Otherwise, there's not much point, is there? Harry, Ron, and Hermione all looked at each other anxiously. I sure hope you're right, Violet, Ron said, flopping backward onto his bed. She is, said Harry. He looked up at Violet, a small grin forming on his face. Don't you know, Ron, Vi's always right. Neither Mr. Weasley nor Percy were at home much over the following week. Both left the house each morning before the rest of the family got up, and returned well after dinner every night. It's been an absolute uproar, Percy told them importantly the Sunday evening before they were due to return to Hogwarts. I've been putting out fires all week. People keep sending howlers, and of course, if you don't open a howler straight away, it explodes. Scorch marks all over my desk, and my best quill reduced to cinders. Why are they all sending howlers? Asked Ginny, who was mending her copy of 1,000 magical herbs and fungi with spellotape on the rug in front of the living room fire. Complaining about the security at the World Cup, said Percy. They want compensation for their ruined property. Mundungus Fletcher's put in a claim for a 12-bedroom tent with an en-suite jacuzzi, but I've got his number. I know for a fact he was sleeping under a cloak propped on sticks. Mrs. Weasley glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was a remarkable clock. It was completely useless if you wanted to know the time, but otherwise very informative. It had 9 golden hands, and each of them was engraved with one of the Weasley family's names. There were no numerals around the face, but descriptions of where each family member might be. Home, school, and work were there, but there was also traveling, lost, hospital, prison, and in the position where the number 12 would be on a normal clock, mortal peril. 8 of the hands were currently pointing to the home position, but Mr. Weasley's, which was the longest, was still pointing to work. Mrs. Weasley signed. Your father hasn't had to go into the office on weekends since the days of you-know-who, she said. They're working him far too hard. His dinner's going to be ruined if he doesn't come home soon. Well, father feels he's got to make up for his mistake at the match, doesn't he said Percy. If truth be told, he was a tad unwise to make a public statement without clearing it with his head of department first. Don't you dare blame your father for what that wretched Skeeter woman wrote, said Mrs. Weasley, flaring up at once. If Dad hadn't said anything, she would have just said it was disgraceful that nobody from the ministry had commented, said Bill, who was playing chess with Ron. Rita Skeeter never makes anyone look good. Remember, she interviewed all the Gringotts charm breakers once, and she called me a long-haired pillock. Well, it is a bit long, dear, said Mrs. Weasley gently. If you just let me know, Mum. Rain lashed against the living room window. Hermione was immersed in Standard Book of Spells, grade 4 copies of which Mrs. Weasley had bought for her Harry, and Ron in Diagon Alley Violet had, very stealthily, tucked a small pouch of coins into Mrs. Weasley's handbag to repay her, knowing she would never take the money if it was offered up front. Charlie was darning a fireproof balaclava. Harry was polishing his firebolt while Violet also had her nose in a book. Fred and George were sitting in a far corner, quills out, talking in whispers, their heads bent over a piece of parchment. "What are you two up to?" said Mrs. Weasley sharply, her eyes on her twins. "Homework," said Fred vaguely. "Don't be ridiculous, you're still on holiday," said Mrs. Weasley. "Yeah, we've left it a bit late," said George. "You're not, by any chance, writing out a new order form, are you?" said Mrs. Weasley shrewdly. "You wouldn't be thinking of restarted Weasley's Wizard Wheezes by any chance?" "Now, Mum," said Fred, looking up at her, a pained look on his face. "If the Hogwarts Express crashed tomorrow and George and I died, how would you feel to know that the last thing we ever heard from you was an unfounded accusation?" Everyone laughed, even Mrs. Weasley. "Oh, your father's coming," she said suddenly, looking up at the clock again. Mr. Weasley's hand had suddenly spun from work to traveling. A second later it had shuddered to a halt on home with the others, and they heard him calling from the kitchen. "Coming, Arthur," called Mrs. Weasley, hurrying out of the room. A few moments later, Mr. Weasley came into the warm living room carrying his dinner on a tray. He looked completely exhausted. "Well, the fat's really in the fire now," he told Mrs. Weasley as he sat down in an armchair near the hearth and toyed unenthusiastically with his somewhat shriveled cauliflower. "Rita Skeeter's been ferreting around all week, looking for more ministry mess-ups to report. And now she's found out about poor old Bertha going missing, so that'll be the headline in the Prophet tomorrow. Idle Bagman, he should have sent someone to look for her ages ago. Mr. Crouch has been saying it for weeks and weeks," said Percy swiftly. "Crouch is very lucky Rita hasn't found out about Winky," said Mr. Weasley irritably. "There'd have been a week's worth of headlines on his house, Elf being caught holding the wand that conjured the dark mark. I thought we were all agreed that that elf, while irresponsible, didn't conjure the mark," said Percy hotly. "If you ask me, Mr. Crouch is very lucky no one at Thedley Prophet knows how mean he is to elves," said Hermione angrily. "Now look here, Hermione," said Percy. "A high-ranking ministry official like Mr. Crouch deserved unswerving obedience from his servants. His slave, you mean," said Hermione, her voice rising passionately, "because he didn't Winky, did he? I think you'd all better go upstairs and check that you've packed properly," said Mrs. Weasley, breaking up the argument. "Come on now, all of you. Violet closed her book, her recently acquired copy of Harry's Snout, Human Heart, an anonymous werewolf's autobiography, with a snap, and headed back upstairs with Ginny and Hermione. The rain sounded even louder near the top of the house, accompanied by loud whistles and moans from the wind, not to mention sporadic howls from the ghoul who lived in the attic. Crookshanks was asleep on Violet's bed and barely cracked open a single orange eye when they entered. "Budge up, Crooks," Violet said to the cat, lifting him despite his disgruntled mews so that she could lay her belongings out on the bed. She set Crookshanks down on her pillow, where he immediately went about settling in again, eyeing her unhappily all the while. "Here's the stuff Mum got for us in Diagon Alley," Ginny said, holding out two bulging shopping bags out to Violet and Hermione. "And I think she got some gold out of your vault for you, Violet. And she's washed all our socks." Violet carefully emptied the bag's parcels onto her bed and dropped the money bag and a load of socks next to it. She started unwrapping the shopping. Apart from the standard book of spells, grade 4 by Miranda Goshawk, she had a handful of new quills, a dozen rolls of parchment, and refills for her potion-making kit. She had been running low on lionfish spines and essence of belladonna. She was just matching up her socks when there was a rap at the door, and Mrs. Weasley stuck her head in. "Still packing, girls. Good, good. I've got something else for you here," she said, and bustled inside, closing the door behind her. She had in her arms what looked like a bundle of mismatched fabric. "Here, Ginny, this one's yours." She held out a load of pale pink chiffon, which Ginny accepted with mild alarm, and Hermione. "For you." Hermione scrambled to collect all of the floaty blue material. "And one for you as well, Violet, dear." Mrs. Weasley pressed into her hands what Violet realized was not a load of fabric at all, but a dress. It was dark green and made of some sort of patterned satiny material, with great poofy sleeves and dozens of little pink flowers sewn onto the front. Violet held it out in bewilderment. What's this for?" "It says on your school list you've got to have dress robes for this year," said Mrs. Weasley. "Clothes for formal occasions." "Where did you get this from?" Ginny asked, holding out her dress as well. It had a very lovely embroidered collar with lace trim. "I made yours, Ginny, dear," said Mrs. Weasley, flushing slightly. "I used to make all your dresses, do you remember? That was when you were little, of course, before you stopped letting me pick out your clothes for you." Ginny's face went beet red. She turned quickly under the guise of holding the dress up the light. Hermione was staring at her dress as well, eyes wide and sparkling. "Mrs. Weasley, this is beautiful. I didn't know you were such a skilled seamstress." "Oh, well, thank you, dear." "I wish that I could take the credit for it," said Mrs. Weasley with a small chuckle. "I bought that dress ages ago for some party or another that Arthur was invited to. I only wore it the once. Too nervous about it catching on something or getting a stain. I couldn't fit into it now, of course, but it should fit you nicely. And yours." Violet tore her eyes from the dress to meet Mrs. Weasley's gaze, which was oddly bright. "It's a hand-me-down, dear. I hope you don't mind." "It's a bit old-fashioned, I'm afraid, but it ought to suit you nicely." Arthur's sister was on the tall side as well. "Aunt Tessie," Ginny exclaimed, looking over at Violet's dress. "How come I've never seen her dressed like that, Mrs.?" Weasley shook her head and said, "No, not Tessie, goodness. Can you imagine this was your father's oldest sister, Imogen?" Ginny frowned. "I didn't know I had an Aunt Imogen." "She passed away before you were born, dear," said Mrs. Weasley gently. "It was very sudden. Your father doesn't like to talk about her very much." She took a deep breath and smiled at Violet. "But she was a very elegant woman, and I'd hate for this dress to spend another 30 years collecting dust. You might want to let it air out before wearing it, Violet." Now that Mrs. Weasley mentioned it, the dress did have a rather musty odor to it. Not that that detracted from its beauty or the sentimental value behind it. Violet had never worn a dress like this before. Come to think of it, she hadn't worn a dress since she was very young, before she was big enough to start wearing Aunt Petunia's old clothes. "Thank you, Mrs. Weasley," said Violet quietly. I'll be really careful with it, I promise. Oh, don't you worry about it, dear, said Mrs. Weasley. It's yours now. Oh, Violet said, and then suddenly she was crying. It was such a simple thing to be given an article of hand-me-down clothing. But the fact that this dress had once belonged to a family member, one that was no longer living, no less, and that the Weasleys trusted Violet, cared about her enough to let her have it, it was all too much. Violet bit down on the inside of her lip to try and stop the flow of tears, but the next moment she found herself pulled into a warm, crushing hug. Mrs. Weasley was holding her tightly to her chest, and even though Violet was quite a bit taller than her, she managed to rest her chin on Mrs. Weasley's shoulder. You're part of this family now, Mrs. Weasley said fiercely, sounding quite tearful herself. I'm afraid you're stuck with us, dear. Violet let out a gasp of laughter and wrapped her arms around Mrs. Weasley as well, as much as she was able. Mrs. Weasley let go of her with one arm and gestured at Ginny and Hermione. Get in here, you two. Come on, we're having a hug. Ginny awkwardly approached only to be yanked into her mother's arms and squashed against Violet's side, and Hermione was treated to the same fate as soon as she was in reach. I know you're used to hearing people tell the boys to look after you, Mrs. Weasley said, her voice slightly muffled. And they do as best a job they can, bless them, but you've got to look after each other as well, girls. If there's one lesson I can pass on to you, it's that you've got to take care of one another. And if you ever need help, if you're too scared or angry or can't handle something on your own, you can come to me, I love you. You can always come to me for anything you need. Do you understand that? The three girls nodded awkwardly, as much as they could in their cramped positions, and Mrs. Weasley finally released them all. Violet's weren't the only pair of damp eyes in the room anymore. They all took a moment to collect themselves, and Mrs. Weasley heaved a heavy sigh and smiled around at Violet, Ginny, and Hermione. I'll let you get back to packing up your things, said Mrs. Weasley. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with her sleeve. I've got to go and check the boys anyways. Goodness knows if I don't, they won't have a single thing folded. All of them chuckled at that. Then Mrs. Weasley gave a little wave and left the room without another word, closing the door behind her again. Violet, Ginny, and Hermione stared at the door for a moment, then glanced around at each other before nervously looking away again. They resumed packing in silence and went to bed without another word. Chapter 7. Aboard the Hogwarts Express. There was a definite end of the holidays gloom in the air when Violet awoke next morning. Heavy rain was still splattering against the windows as she got dressed in a jeans skirt and oversized jumper. They would change into their school robes on the Hogwarts Express. She, Ginny, and Hermione were sitting around the kitchen table waiting on their breakfast when there was a soft whoosh from the fireplace, and Amos Diggory's head appeared in the flames. Arthur, he shouted, and Hermione sloshed orange juice all down her front in shock. Where the devil are you? Just a moment, Amos, said Mrs. Weasley. She bustled out of the kitchen and hollowed up the stairs. Arthur, Arthur, urgent message from the ministry. There was a great clattering from the hall as Mr. Weasley came rocketing into the kitchen with his robes on back to front. He threw himself down in front of the fireplace and said, What's happened? Mad eyes off his head again, said Mr. Diggory's head. I only just heard about it, Arthur, but with everything going on I thought you ought to get involved. Yes, yes, of course, for heaven's sake, Marley. A quill, please. Mrs. Weasley began rummaging anxiously through the drawers. Violet was so busy staring at the fireplace that she didn't even notice Harry, Ron, and the Weasley twins come in. Muggle neighbors heard bangs and shouting, so they went and called those what do you call ems please mean. Arthur, you've got to get over there. Here, said Mrs. Weasley breathlessly, pushing a piece of parchment, a bottle of ink, and a crumpled quill into Mr. Weasley's hands. It's a real stroke of luck I heard about it, said Mr. Diggory's head, speaking very quickly and looking completely oblivious to the sparks and flames licking around it. I had to come into the office early to send a couple of owls, and I found the improper use of magic lot all setting off if Rita Skeeter gets a hold of this one. Arthur, What does Mad-Eye say happened? Asked Mr. Weasley, unscrewing the ink bottle, loading up his quill, and preparing to take notes. Mr. Diggory's head rolled its eyes. Says he heard an intruder in his yard. Says he was creeping toward the house, but was ambushed by his dustbins. What did the dustbins do? Asked Mr. Weasley, scribbling frantically. Made one hell of a noise and fired rubbish everywhere, as far as I can tell, said Mr. Diggory. Apparently one of them was still rocketing around when the policemen turned up, Mr. Weasley groaned. And what about the intruder? Arthur, you know Mad-Eye, said Mr. Diggory's head, rolling its eyes again. Someone creeping into his yard in the dead of night. More likely there's a very shell-shocked cat wandering around somewhere, covered in potato peelings. But if the improper use of magic lark get their hands on Mad-Eye, he's had it think of his record. We've got to get him off on a minor charge. Something in your department what are exploding dustbins worth. Maybe a caution, said Mr. Weasley, still writing very fast, his brow furrowed. Mad-Eye didn't use his wand. He didn't actually attack anyone. I'll bet he leapt out of bed and started jinxing everything he could reach through the window, said Mr. Diggory, but they'll have a job proving it. There aren't any casualties. All right, I'm off, Mr. Weasley said, and he stuffed the parchment with his notes in it into his pocket and dashed out of the kitchen again. Mr. Diggory's head looked around at Mrs. Weasley. Sorry about this, Marley, it said more calmly, bothering you so early and all. But Arthur's the only one who can get Mad-Eye off, and Mad-Eye's supposed to be starting his new job today. Why, he had to choose last night. Never mind, Amos, said Mrs. Weasley. Sure you won't have a bit of toast or anything before you go? Oh, go on then, said Mr. Diggory. Mrs. Weasley took a piece of buttered toast from the stack on the kitchen table, put it into the fire tongs, and transferred it into Mr. Diggory's mouth. Thanks, he said in a muffled voice, and then, with a small pop, vanished. Violet could hear Mr. Weasley calling hurried goodbyes to Bill, Charlie, and Percy. Within 5 minutes he was back in the kitchen, his robes on the right way, dragging a comb through his hair. I'd better hurry, you have a good term, children, said Mr. Weasley, nodding around at them all, fastening a cloak over his shoulders and preparing to disapparate. Marley, are you going to be all right taking the kids to King's Cross? Of course I will, she said. You should look after Mad-Eye, will be fine. As Mr. Weasley vanished, Bill and Charlie entered the kitchen. Bill's hair was loose about his shoulders, rather than tied back as he usually kept it, and Violet quickly stuffed her mouth with toast to stop it from hanging open like a fool. Did someone say Mad-Eye? He asked sleepily. What's he been up to now? He says someone tried to break into his house last night, said Mrs. Weasley. Mad-Eye Moody, said George thoughtfully, dropping into the chair next to Ginny and reaching for his own slice of toast. Isn't he that nutter? Your father thinks very highly of Alastor Moody, said Mrs. Weasley sternly. Yeah, well, Dad collects plugs, doesn't he? Said Fred quietly as Mrs. Weasley left the room. Birds of a feather. Moody was a great wizard in his time, said Bill. He's an old friend of Dumbledore's, isn't he? Said Charlie. Dumbledore's not what you'd call normal, though, is he? Said Fred. I mean, I know he's a genius and everything. Woe is Mad-Eye Moody? Asked Harry. He's retired, used to work at the ministry, said Charlie. I met him once when Dad took me to work with him. He was an aura one of the best. A dark wizard catcher, he added, seeing Harry's blank face. Half the cells in Azkaban are full because of him. He made himself loads of enemies, though. The families of people he caught, mainly. And I heard he's been getting paranoid in his old age. Doesn't trust anyone anymore. Sees dark wizards everywhere. Violet's mouth was still full of toast, so she couldn't mention that perhaps there were dark wizards everywhere. The crowd marching at the cup wasn't exactly small. Bill and Charlie decided to come and see everyone off at King's Cross Station, but Percy, apologizing most profusely, said that he really needed to get to work. I just can't justify taking more time off at the moment, he told them. Mr. Crouch is really starting to rely on me. Yeah, you know what, Perce, said George seriously. I reckon he'll know your name soon. Mrs. Weasley had braved the telephone in the village post office to order 3 ordinary Muggle taxis to take them to London. Arthur tried to borrow ministry cars for us, Mrs. Weasley whispered to Violet as they stood in the rain-washed yard, watching the taxi drivers heaving 7 heavy Hogwarts trunks into their cars. But there weren't any to spare. Oh dear, they don't look happy, do they? Violet didn't like to tell Mrs. Weasley that Muggle taxi drivers rarely transported overexcited owls, and Pigwidgeon was making an ear-splitting racket. Nor did it help that a number of filibusters' fabulous wet start. No-heat fireworks went off unexpectedly when Fred's trunk sprang open, causing the driver carrying it to yell with alarm and pain as Crookshanks clawed his way up the man's leg. The journey was uncomfortable, owing to the fact that they were jammed into the back of the taxis with their trunks. Crookshanks took quite a while to recover from the fireworks, and by the time they entered London, Violet and Ginny's hands were severely scratched. Everyone was relieved to get out at King's Cross, even though the rain was coming down harder than ever, and they got soaked carrying their trunks across the busy road and into the station. Violet was used to getting onto platform 9 3/4 by now. It was a simple matter of walking straight through the apparently solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. The only tricky part was doing this in an unobtrusive way, so as to avoid attracting Muggle attention. They did it in groups today. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the most conspicuous, they were accompanied by Hedwig and Pig, went first. Violet and Ginny followed next. They leaned casually against the barrier, chatting unconcernedly, and slid sideways through it. And as they did so, platform 9 3/4 materialized in front of them. The Hogwarts Express, a gleaming scarlet steam engine, was already there, clouds of steam billowing from it, through which the many Hogwarts students and parents on the platform appeared like dark ghosts. Pig became noisier than ever in response to the hooting of many owls through the mist. Violet was immediately on the lookout for her friends. Being unable to meet up with them in Diagon Alley had been a bummer, and she was determined to apologize and explain herself before they could be angry with her. But rather than finding anyone, it was Violet herself who was found. She was heaving her trunk onto the train when a familiar shape appeared beside her to help. "I should have known I'd find you here, surrounded by Weasleys," said Cassius Warrington, grinning down at her. He was a broad-shouldered, long-limbed boy with sandy brown hair, and Violet was delighted at the sight of him. "Cass!" she cried, throwing her arms around him at once. "I was just looking for you. Where's Tracy? Isn't she with you?" "She's already got us a carriage," Cass said, awkwardly returning the hug. "We figured you'd turn up, so I've been keeping a lookout." "Come on, we're at the back." "I've got to say goodbye first," Violet said, looking back down the platform at Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie, who were already surrounded by Fred, George, and the others. "Hold on, I'll be right back. I might be seeing you all sooner than you think," said Charlie, grinning as he hugged Ginny goodbye. "Why?" said Fred keenly. "You'll see," said Charlie. "Just don't tell Percy I mentioned it. It's classified information until such time as the Ministry sees fit to release it, after all." "Yeah, I sort of wish I were back at Hogwarts this year," said Bill, hands in his pockets, looking almost wistfully back at the train. "Why?" said George impatiently. "You're going to have an interesting year," said Bill, his eyes twinkling. "I might even get time off to come and watch a bit of it." "A bit off what?" said Ron. But at that moment the whistle blew and Mrs. Weasley chivied them toward the train door. "Thanks for having us to stay, Mrs. Weasley," said Hermione as they boarded. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Weasley," said Violet earnestly. "Oh, it was my pleasure, dears," said Mrs. Weasley. "I'd invite you for Christmas, but, well, I expect you're all going to want to stay at Hogwarts, what with one thing and another." "Mum," said Ron irritably, "what do you 3 know what we don't?" "You'll find out this evening, I expect," said Mrs. Weasley, smiling. "It's going to be very exciting, mind you. I'm very glad they've changed the rules." "What rules?" said Harry, Ron, Fred, and George together. "I'm sure Professor Dumbledore will tell you. Now, behave, won't you?" Won't you, Fred and George? The pistons hissed loudly, and the train began to move. Tell us what's happening at Hogwarts. Fred bellowed out of the window as Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie sped away from them. What rules are they changing? But Mrs. Weasley only smiled and waved. Before the train had rounded the corner, she, Bill, and Charlie had disapparated. Violet quickly broke from Harry, Hermione, and the Weasleys to go and find Cassius and Tracy. She didn't have to look very hard. Cass was standing idly in the corridor of the very next car, clearly waiting for her. Sorry, sorry, Violet said, hurrying over to him. Mrs. Weasley was talking about something secret happening at Hogwarts, and they wouldn't tell us. There was a loud shriek from the inside the compartment Cass was standing by, and a moment later the door had been flung open, and there stood Tracy Davis, beaming brightly at Violet. There you are, Tracy squealed, immediately launching herself at Violet and wrapping her in a tight hug. Cass said he found you, but I didn't believe him since you ran off again. Oh, Violet, I've missed you so much. Tracy let of her abruptly and stepped back, holding her by the shoulders and smiling dramatically. Tracy Davis was a very short, very pretty black girl who, while Violet had been getting taller over the years, had been growing whiter instead. Her round cheeks were pulled into a wide grin, clearly trying to display her teeth. You got your braces off, Violet exclaimed, staring at Tracy's pearly white, perfectly straight teeth. I know, Tracy cried, hopping up and down. Just last week, too. I can't believe how different it feels after having all that metal in my mouth for 4 years. I've still got this horrible retainer. She flicked her tongue and dislodged a previously unseen piece of bright pink plastic from the roof of her mouth, then sucked it back into place, but it's not nearly as bad as before. God, that's horrifying, Cass muttered, staring at Tracy's mouth with obvious discomfort. Muggles are so weird. We make do, said Tracy brightly. She reached down and grabbed Violet's hand, pulling her into the compartment and into the seat beside her. Cass followed and shut the door behind him before flopping into the seat opposite the girls. All right, he said, propping his feet up on the bench and looking sternly at Violet. Let's get this over with. Tell us everything you've been up to this summer. Violet drew up short. She had been up to a lot this summer. It didn't seem quite fair to dump all of that onto her friends before hearing what they had to say. Why don't you two go first? Cass stayed home with his mother and sprained his wrist falling out of a tree, Tracy said at once. He was trying to get Rasputin out of a bird's nest. WH what? Violet said. Who's Rasputin? My bloody owl, Cassius grumbled. He flew away after he hit the ground, of course. Are you all right? Just peachy. Took a day trip to St. Mungo's in London. Convinced my mother to eat something called a cheeseburger. Meanwhile, Tracy, he shot a look at her across the aisle, learned how to braid her niece's hair in about 7 different ways, and mailed me a muggle book full of frozen pictures of women smiling and touching their hair. I've told you, they're not frozen, Tracy said. That's just how muggle pictures look, and it was a magazine, not a book. There's a difference. I still don't see why you sent it to me, Cass sniffed. What am I supposed to know about muggle women and their hair? I was trying to show you what I'd been doing with Michaela's hair, which you'd have realized if you stopped being thick for 5 minutes. Violet was stunned. She'd never heard Tracy speak to anyone like that, other than Pansy Parkinson, a horrible bully of a girl in their year who absolutely deserved it. But when she looked at Cass to see his reaction, Violet was surprised again to see him laughing. It felt as though something had changed over the summer, something that she was not privy to. Sounds like you two have been keeping in touch, Violet said, smiling tightly as both of her friends nodded. We've been writing each other a few times a week, said Cassius, casually. Mother said I was hogging the owl. I wish Harry would let you borrow Hedwig more often, said Tracy, or maybe you could even get urinal. Then we'd have an easier time talking. I have enough trouble looking after Crookshanks. In the seat beside her, the cat raised his head at the sound of his name. Besides, you could have just called me on the phone. I didn't want you get you in trouble again. Things are different at home now, You could have called. Violet knew that her tone was too cold. She could feel the laughter and joy draining from the compartment, replaced by awkward silence and tension. She didn't know why there was such a bitter taste in her mouth over hearing Cass and Tracy talking to each other over the summer. Shouldn't she have been happy? Wasn't this better than having them not talk at all? It would be better if they had talked home, too, said a nasty little voice in the back of Violet's mind. So, said Cass after a long pause. The scenery was flying past out the window. They were racing through farmland now, the ground muddy and grey after the summer harvest. It's your turn, I suppose, Roman 6. What have you been up to? Harry and I spent the first month and a half at the Dursleys. Violet started, trying to keep her voice even, and then the Weasleys came and got us. They took us to the Quidditch World Cup. Tracy and Cass's mouths fell open. You were there? Tracy asked in an odd whisper. But I read about some sort of riot that happened. Did you see any of it? We were in the middle of it, Violet told her. We were all asleep when the marching started, but Mr. Weasley woke us up and told us to run. So you know what really happened then, said Cass suddenly. The Prophet's being all sorts of cagey about it, but nobody else is publishing any information. Do you know what started it? Over the next half an hour, Violet told them everything she knew about the incident at the Cup, the marching, the men in masks, the Muggle family being levitated above the crowd, all the people frightening and running as the marchers advanced, the dark mark appearing overhead. Tracy gasped when Violet told them about being hit by the stunning charm and clutched tightly onto Violet's arm as the details about Winky and Harry's wand being used were revealed. The thick silence had settled over them once more as Violet finished her story. I can't believe it, Cass muttered, shaking his head. I can't believe they'd do something like that after all these years. How dare they? Well, I was going to say, how dare they show their faces in public? But with the masks on, I don't suppose they'd dare to. Harry told me they ran into Malfoy after we got separated, Violet said. She dropped her voice and leaned forward. He said Malfoy all but admitted his father was out there marching with them. Now that I can believe, Cass said. Lucius Malfoy was a big name in the papers after the Dark Lord fell. I still don't understand how the slimy bastard weaseled his way out of Azkaban. The Dark Lord. You know who, Cassius explained, waving his hand dismissively. It's just another name for him, you know, like, I know what it is, Violet said. I've never heard anyone else call him that. Only Pettigrew. Cassius' face went a shade paler. His eyes darted away from Violet's. It's just what I grew up hearing, he mumbled, in the papers and stuff. But what happened to the house elf? Tracy said, interrupting the swirl of questions in Violet's mind. Winky. Didn't anyone help her? Violet shook her head. I wanted to. Me and Hermione tried to make Mr. Crouch leave her alone, but no one would listen. Mr. Weasley pulled us away. I didn't see what happened to her. It's awful, Tracy said emphatically. I never knew house elves were treated like that. I mean, it was bad enough when you talked about Derby, but I didn't realize I never thought there were more of them. Most old wizarding families have at least one house elf, Cassius said. It's just normal for us. Tracy rounded on him. For us, do I have a house elf? She demanded. I just said most families do, didn't I? Ours has been around since my father was a little boy. Tracy's mouth worked in soundless shock and disbelief. Cass looked between her and Violet's startled faces and shrugged. We don't hit her or make her iron her own bloody hands, if that's what you're thinking, he said defensively. She's called Barnet. She used to look after me when I was little, dress me and things. These days she just looks after the house and cooks for us. Muggles have maids, don't they? Muggles usually pay their maids, Violet said, and they don't make them dress in rags and pillowcases. Cass's cheeks went a blotchy sort of pink, and he said, well, it's not like we can just give her clothes now, is it? She'd be horrified. You just said you saw Crouch's elf having a meltdown over being sacked. Being freed, you mean? Tracy challenged. After spending her whole life as a slave. They're not slaves, said Cassius. We're not keeping them or making them do things against their will. So you say, said Tracy angrily. But have you ever actually asked your house elf what she wants? Because it sounds like Malfoy's house. Elf was being made to do a lot of things against his will. I am not like Malfoy, said Cassius darkly. I am nothing like that slimy little wretch, nothing. Well, both your families have slaves, so I suppose that's something you have in common. You don't know what you're talking about, Tracy, Cass said flatly. Tracy threw her hands up in the air. Unbelievable, she cried. Absolutely unbelievable. Violet startled as Tracy turned to her, eyes blazing. Tell me something else about your summer. Talk about something else so I don't have to listen to him anymore. Oh, come on, that's not Violet. Start talking. Something's going on Hogwarts this year, Violet blurted, looking nervously between Tracy and Cass, both of whom were fuming. Bill and Charlie kept making comments about it, but Percy and Mr. Weasley said it had to be kept a secret, so I don't know exactly what it is, but I suppose it must be something important for all of them to act so funny about it. Who are Bill and Charlie? Tracy asked, still staring fiercely at her. Ron's older brothers, Violet answered. Are they fit? Oh, said Violet, blushing immediately as she thought of Bill's long hair and earring and Charlie's easy smile. Yeah, actually. I mean, I suppose. Tell me all about them, Tracy demanded at once. We never get to talk about boys and I want to. Really, said Cass incredulously. Do you have to while I'm sitting right? Which one's cuter, Bill or Charlie? Tracy interrupted. By the time Violet got around to stammering the details about Charlie's strong, calloused hands, Cass had retrieved a book from his trunk and stretched out across the length of the seats, burying his face behind the pages. He didn't speak to either of them for the rest of the train ride. The silence continued even as they changed into their school robes, and when the Hogwarts Express slowed down at last and finally stopped in the pitch darkness of Hogsmeade Station. As the train doors opened, there was a rumble of thunder overhead. Violet bundled up Crookshanks in her cloak as they left the train, heads bent and eyes narrowed against the downpour. The rain was now coming down so thick and fast that it was as though buckets of ice-cold water were being emptied repeatedly over their heads. "Hello, Hagrid," Violet yelled, seeing a gigantic silhouette at the far end of the platform. "All rig, Violet," Hagrid bellowed back, waving. "See yer at the feast if we darn drown." First years traditionally reached Hogwarts Castle by sailing across the lake with Hagrid. Everyone else took the hundreds of carriages that currently stood waiting for them outside the station, pulled by great black, skeletal horses. Violet, Tracy, and Cassius climbed gratefully into one of them. The door shut with a snap, and a few moments later, with a great lurch, the long procession of carriages was rumbling and splashing its way up the track toward Hogwarts Castle. Chapter 8: The Triwizard Tournament. Through the gates, flanked with statues of winged boars, and up the sweeping drive the carriages trundled, swaying dangerously in what was fast becoming a gale. Leaning against the window, Violet could see Hogwarts coming nearer, its many lighted windows blurred and shimmering behind the thick curtain of rain. Lightning flashed across the sky as their carriages came to a halt before the great oak front doors, which stood at the top of a flight of stone steps. People who had occupied the carriages in front were already hurrying up the stone steps into the castle. Violet and Tracy jumped down from their carriage. Violet accepted Cass's offered hand to help. Tracy did not and dashed up the steps too, looking up only when they were safely inside the cavernous, torchlit entrance hall with its magnificent marble staircase. Through the gathered, sopping crowd, Violet found her brother's eye and waved. "Good thing we made it inside," Tracy said, shivering as she lowered her cloak from over her head. "If the rain keeps up like this, the lake's going to overflow." "I'm soak ag." A large, red, water-filled balloon had dropped from the ceiling onto Tracy's head and exploded. Drenched and sputtering, Tracy staggered sideways into Violet just as a second water bomb dropped, narrowly missing Cassius. It burst at Violet's feet, sending a wave of cold water over her trainers into her socks. People all around them shrieked, and started pushing one another in their efforts to get out of the line of fire. Violet looked up and saw, floating 20 feet above them, Peeves the poltergeist, a little man in a bell-covered hat and an orange bow tie, his wide, malicious face contorted with concentration as he took aim. "Peeves!" yelled an angry voice. "Peeves, come down here at once." Professor McGonagall, deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor House, had come dashing out of the great hall. She skidded on the wet floor and grabbed Hermione around the neck to stop herself from falling. "Ouch, sorry, Miss Granger. That's all right, Professor," Hermione gasped, massaging her throat. "Peeves, get down here now," barked Professor McGonagall, straightening her pointed hat and glaring upward through her square-rimmed spectacles. "Not doing nothing," cackled Peeves, lobbing a water bomb at several fifth-year girls who screamed and dived into the great hall. "Already wet, aren't they? Little squirts. Wee-yay." And he aimed another bomb at a group of second-years who had just arrived. "I shall call the headmaster," shouted Professor McGonagall. "I'm warning you." Peeves stuck out his tongue, threw the last of his water bombs into the air, and zoomed off up the marble staircase, cackling madly. "Well, move along, then," said Professor McGonagall sharply to the bedraggled crowd. "Into the great hall, come on." Violet, Tracy, and Cass slipped and slid across the entrance hall and through the double doors on the right, Tracy whining angrily under her breath as she pushed her sopping hair out of her face. The great hall looked its usual splendid self, decorated for the start-of-term feast. Golden plates and goblets gleamed by the light of hundreds and hundreds of candles floating over the tables in mid-air. It was much warmer in here. The 4 long house tables were packed with chattering students. At the top of the hall, the staff sat along one side of a 5th table, facing their pupils. Violet caught sight of her godfather, Professor Remus Lupin, sitting next to Professor Sprout. He seemed to be searching for something in the crowd of students, and his face lit up as he caught sight of Violet waving madly at him and waved back. Violet, Cass, and Tracy walked straight to the Slytherin table and sat down with the rest of their house. Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked past on the way to their own table all the way on the other side of the hall. "Merlin, I hope they get on with the sorting," Cass grumbled, arms wrapped tightly around himself. "I'm starving." The sorting of new students into houses took place at the start of every school year, but by an unlucky combination of circumstances, Violet hadn't been present at one since her own. She was quite looking forward to it. Violet looked back up at the staff table, hoping to get a better look at Professor Lupin. The last she'd seen him, he'd been quite thin and dressed rather shabbily. Unable to find steady work due to his condition, he'd also never been able to afford much beyond the most basic necessities. Now, seated as far from him as she was, Violet couldn't really see that much of a difference. She noticed, however, that there were rather more empty seats than usual. Hagrid, of course, was still fighting his way across the lake with the first years. Professor McGonagall was presumably supervising the drying of the entrance hall floor, but there was another empty chair too. "Where's the new defense against the dark arts teacher?" she said to Cassius, who also looked up at the teachers. They had never yet had a defense against the dark arts teacher who had lasted more than 3 terms. Professor Lupin had taught the subject last year, but Violet knew for a fact that he wouldn't be reprising the role. Cass looked up and down the staff table. "Maybe they couldn't get anyone," he muttered, frowning. Violet scanned the table again, more anxiously. Tiny little Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, was sitting on a large pile of cushions on Lupin's other side. Professor Sprout, the herbology teacher, whose hat was askew over her flyaway grey hair, was talking to Professor Sinistra of the astronomy department. Beside her was Hagrid's seat, only he could accommodate such a large place setting. On the other side of the table sat Professors Vector and Burbage, who taught arithmancy and Muggle studies respectively, the latter of whom was chatting with the man to her left. Sallow-faced, hook-nosed, dark-haired Professor Snape was the potions master and head of Slytherin House. Prior to that year, Violet would have been mildly pleased to see Professor Snape. But after the events of last year trying to attack Sirius Black, refusing to believe he's innocent even after being hit over the head with proof, Violet wasn't so sure how to feel toward him anymore. On Professor Snape's other side was an empty seat, which Violet assumed was Professor McGonagall's. Next to it, and in the very center of the table, sat Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, his sweeping silver hair and beard shining in the candlelight, his magnificent deep green robes embroidered with many moons and stars. The tips of Dumbledore's long, thin fingers were together, and he was resting his chin upon them, looking up at the ceiling through his half-moon spectacles, as though lost in thought. Violet looked up at the ceiling, too. It was enchanted to look like the sky outside, and she had never seen it look this stormy. Black and purple clouds were swirling across it, and as another thunderclap sounded outside, a fork of lightning flashed across it. "Oh, get in here already," Cass moaned, beside Violet. "The sooner this is over with, the sooner we cane at." The words were no sooner out of his mouth than the doors of the great hall opened and silence fell. Professor McGonagall was leading a long line of first years up to the top of the hall. If Violet, Tracy, and Cassius were wet, it was nothing to how these first years looked. They appeared to have swum across the lake rather than sailed. All of them were shivering with a combination of cold and nerves as they filed along the staff table and came to a halt in a line facing the rest of the school, all of them except the smallest of the lot, a boy with mousy hair, who was wrapped in what Violet recognized to be Hagrid's moleskin overcoat. The coat was so big for him that it looked as though he were draped in a furry black circus tent. His small face protruded from the collar, looking almost painfully excited. Violet watched him grin over at the Gryffindor table and give a double thumbs up. Professor McGonagall now placed a three-legged stool on the ground before the first years, and on top of it, an extremely old, dirty, patched wizard's hat. The first years stared at it. So did everyone else. For a moment, there was silence. Then a long tear near the bring opened wide like a mouth, and the hat broke into song. 1,000 years or more ago, when I was newly sown, there lived 4 wizards of renown, whose names are still well known. Bold Gryffindor from Wildmoor, fair Ravenclaw from Glen, sweet Hufflepuff from Valley Broad, shrewd Slytherin from Fen. They shared a wish, a hope, a dream. They hatched a daring plan to educate young sorcerers, thus Hogwarts School began. Now each of these 4 founders formed their own house, for each did value different virtues in the ones they had to teach. By Gryffindors, the bravest were prized far beyond the rest. For Ravenclaw, the cleverest would always be the best. For Hufflepuff, hard workers were most worthy of admission, and power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. While still alive, they did divide their favorites from the throng, yet how to pick the worthy ones when they were dead and gone? 'Twas Gryffindor who found the way. He whipped me off his head. The founders put some brains in me so I could choose instead. Now slip me snug about your ears. I've never yet been wrong. I'll have a look inside your mind and tell where you'll belong. The great hall rang with applause as the sorting hat finished. That's not the song it sang when we were sorted, Violet said to Tracy, clapping along with everyone else. It sings a different one every year, said Tracy. This one was really good, too. Last year's was a bit silly, I think. Professor McGonagall was now unrolling a large scroll of parchment. When I call out your name, you will sit on the stool, and I will place the hat upon your head, she told the first years. When the hat announces your house, you will go and sit at the appropriate table. Ackerley Stewart, a boy walked forward, visible trembling from head to foot, settled himself on the stool, and stared out at them all until his eyes disappeared beneath the brim of the sorting hat. Ravenclaw, shouted the hat. Stuart Ackerley took off the hat and hurried into a seat at the Ravenclaw table, where everyone was applauding him. Baddock Malcolm. A skinny boy with very short brown hair took the stool and balled his hands at his side as McGonagall placed the hat on top of his head. Slytherin, the Slytherin table, along with Violet, erupted with cheers as Baddock came skipping over, a nervous smile on his face. He settled into a seat on the same side of the table where Violet sat, and she leaned back to whisper a quick welcome to him. Branstone, Elena. Hufflepuff, Caldwell, Owen. Hufflepuff, Creevy, Dennis. The tiny boy staggered forward, tripping over Hagrid's moleskin, just as Hagrid himself sidled into the great hall through a door behind the teacher's table. About twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 3 times as broad, Hagrid, with his long, wild, tangled black hair and beard, looked slightly alarming, a misleading impression, for Violet knew that Hagrid possessed the kindest heart she had ever known. She waved discreetly to him as he sat down at the end of the staff table, and received a quick wink in return. Dennis Creevy put on the sorting hat, which immediately shouted Gryffindor. Hagrid clapped along with the Gryffindors as Dennis Creevy, beaming widely, took off the hat and hurried over to the Gryffindor table. His surname sounded familiar, and Violet realized why when she saw who he sat next to. Carlin Creevy was another Gryffindor, a 3rd year now, though in his 1st year he had made quite a nuisance of himself toward Violet and Harry, at least. Even now, she could see him pointing down the table to where Harry sat, whispering excitedly to his little brother. The sorting continued, boys and girls with varying degrees of fright on their little faces moving one by one to the 3-legged stool, the line dwindling slowly as Professor McGonagall passed the L's. Violet's stomach rumbled audibly as MacDonald, Natalie, joined the Gryffindor table. "Bloody hell, there's so many of them," Cassius grumbled, clapping half-heartedly when Pritchard Graham was sorted into Slytherin. "If this doesn't hurry up, I'm eating that one." "Cass," Violet hissed, giggling despite herself. Cass shot her a smirk, then leaned forward to grin toothily at Pritchard. Tracy wrinkled her nose as Violet laughed, and finally, with Whitby, Kevin. Hufflepuff. The sorting ended. Professor McGonagall picked up the hat and the stool and carried them away. "Finally," said Cass, seizing his knife and fork and looking expectantly at his golden plate. Professor Dumbledore had gotten to his feet. He was smiling around at the students, his arms opened wide in welcome. "I have only 2 words to say to you," his deep voice echoing around the hall. "Tuck in." Cass let out a cheer as the empty fist filled magically before their eyes. All manner of succulent meats and hearty vegetables, moats of gravy, trays and trays of bread rolls and savory pies, and all forms of potatoes. Violet greedily filled her plate with everything within reach and promptly began to stuff her face, while Tracy and Cassius did the same. The rain continued to drum heavily against the high, dark glass. Another clap of thunder shook the windows, and the stormy ceiling flashed, illuminating the golden plates as the remains of the first course were replaced, instantly, with puddings. "Give me some of that," Violet said, pointing to a large, mouth-wateringly rich slab of chocolate cake. "No, more than that," she said as Tracy began to cut her a narrow slice. "You'll spoil your figure," Tracy said reprovingly, though she slid a much more generous slice onto Violet's plate. "That's what my auntie's always saying to me, at least." "Rubbish," Violet grunted, her mouth already full of chocolate gâteau. "Have some, it's really good." "Here I was joking about eating a 1st year," said Cass, staring at Violet, "but it looks like you might be the only to actually do it." Violet took another huge, shameless bite of chocolate cake. She'd spent too many days and nights with her belly aching from hunger. If there was food in front of her, she was going to eat it, her figure be damned. When the puddings, too, had been demolished, and the last crumbs had faded off the plates, leaving them sparkling clean, Albus Dumbledore got to his feet again. The buzz of chatter filling the hall ceased almost at once, so that only the howling wind and pounding rain could be heard. "So," said Dumbledore, smiling around at them all, "now that we are all fed and watered, I must once more ask for your attention while I give out a few notices. Mr. Filch, the caretaker, has asked me to tell you that the list of objects forbidden inside of the castle has this year been extended to include screaming yo-yos, fanged frisbees, and ever-bashing boomerangs. The full list comprises some 437 items, I believe, and can be viewed in Mr. Filch's office, if anybody would like to check." The corners of Dumbledore's mouth twitched. He continued, "As ever, I would like to remind you all that the forest on the ground is out of bounds to students, as is the village of Hogsmeade to all below third year. It is also my painful duty to inform you that the Inter-House Quidditch Cup will not take place this year." An audible gasp rippled through the great hall. Before the murmurs could become too loud, Dumbledore went on. "This is due to an event that will be starting in October and continuing throughout the school year, taking up much of the teachers' time and energy, but I am sure you will all enjoy it immensely. I have great pleasure in announcing that this year at Hogwarts." But at that moment, there was a deafening rumble of thunder, and the doors of the great hall banged open. A man stood in the doorway, leaning upon a long staff, shrouded in a black traveling cloak. Every head in the great hall swiveled toward the stranger, suddenly brightly illuminated by a fork of lighting that flashed across the ceiling. He lowered his head, shook out a long mane of grizzled, dark grey hair, then began to walk up toward the teacher's table. A Dulthan echoed through the hall on his every other step. He reached the end of the top table, turned right, and limped heavily toward Dumbledore. Another flash of lightning crossed the ceiling. Violet gasped. The lightning has thrown the man's face into sharp relief, and it was a face unlike any Violet had ever seen. It looked as though it had been carved out of weathered wood by someone who had only the vaguest idea of what human faces are supposed to look like, and was none too skilled with a chisel. Every inch of skin seemed to be scarred. The mouth looked like a diagonal gash, and a large chunk of the nose was missing. But it was the man's eyes that made him frightening. One of them was small, dark, and beady. The other was large, round as a coin, and a vivid, electric blue. The blue eye was moving ceaselessly, without blinking, and was rolling up, down, and from side to side, quite independently of the normal eye, and then it rolled right over, pointing into the back of the man's head, so that all they could see was whiteness. The stranger reached Dumbledore. He stretched out a hand that was as badly scarred as his face, and Dumbledore shook it, muttering words Violet couldn't hear. He seemed to be making some inquiry of the stranger, who shook his head unsmilingly and replied in an undertone. Dumbledore nodded and gestured the man to the empty seat on his right-hand side. The stranger sat down, shook his mane of dark grey hair out of his eyes, pulled a plate of sausages toward him, raised it to what was left of his nose, and sniffed it. He then took a small knife out of his pocket, speared a sausage on the end of it, and began to eat. His normal eye was fixed upon the sausages, but the blue eye was still darting restlessly around in its socket, taking in the hall and the students. "May I introduce our new defense against the dark arts teacher?" said Dumbledore brightly into the silence. "Professor Moody." It was usual for new staff members to be greeted with applause, but none of the staff or students clapped except Dumbledore and Hagrid, who both put their hands together and applauded, but the sound echoed dismally into the silence, and they stopped fairly quickly. Everyone else seemed too transfixed by Moody's bizarre appearance to do more than stare at him. "Moody," Violet whispered. "Ron's dad went to help somebody called Mad-Eye Moody this morning." "Do you reckon that's him?" "Yes," Cassius croaked, and Violet looked at him in surprise. Cass's face was white as a sheet, his nostrils flared, his eyes fixed on where Moody sat, now spearing his third sausage. "That's him." "Do you know him?" Violet asked. "Cass, are you all right?" When Cass didn't respond, Violet reached up and placed a hand lightly on his arm. He flinched sharply away from her. "No," he said, now looking pointedly away from both her and Moody. "No, I don't." "What happened to him?" Tracy whispered, craning around Violet to see. She was too transfixed by Moody to notice Cass's reaction to the man. "What happened to his face?" Moody seemed totally indifferent to his less-than-warm welcome. Ignoring the jug of pumpkin juice in front of him, he reached again into his traveling cloak, pulled out a hip flask, and took a long draught from it. As he lifted his arm to drink, his cloak was pulled a few inches from the ground, and Violet saw, below the table, several inches of carved wooden leg, ending in a clawed foot. Dumbledore cleared his throat. As I was saying, he said, smiling at the sea of students before him, all of whom were still gazing in fascination at Mad-Eye Moody. We are to have the honor of hosting a very exciting event over the coming months, an event that has not been held for over a century. It is my very great pleasure to inform you that the Triwizard Tournament will be taking place at Hogwarts this year. You're joking, said a loud voice from across the hall that Violet knew at once to belong to Fred Weasley. The tension that had filled the hall ever since Moody's arrival suddenly broke. Nearly everyone laughed, and Dumbledore chuckled appreciatively. I am not joking, Mr. Weasley, he said, though now that you mention it, I did hear an excellent one over the summer about a troll, a hag, and a leprechaun who all go into a bar. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat loudly. But maybe this is not the time. No, said Dumbledore. Where was I? Ah, yes, the Triwizard Tournament. Well, some of you will not know what this tournament involves, so I hope those who know will forgive me for giving a short explanation and allow their attention to wander freely. The Triwizard Tournament was first established some 700 years ago as a friendly competition between the three largest European schools of wizardry, Hogwarts, Beauxbatons, and Durmstrang. A champion was selected to represent each school, and the three champions competed in three magical tasks. The schools took it in turns to host the tournament once every 5 years, and it was generally agreed to be a most excellent way of establishing ties between young witches and wizards of different nationalities, until, that is, the death toll mounted so high that the tournament was discontinued. Death toll, Tracy whispered, looking alarmed. Sorry, did he just say death toll? But her anxiety did not seem to be shared by the majority of students in the hall. Many of them were whispering excitedly to one another, and Violet immediately swiveled to look across the Gryffindor table, where Harry's face was upturned in clear interest. There have been several attempts over the century to reinstate the tournament, Dumbledore continued, none of which has been very successful. However, our own departments of international magical cooperation and magical games and sports have decided the time is ripe for another attempt. We have worked hard over the summer to ensure that this time no champion will find themselves in mortal danger. The heads of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang will be arriving with their shortlisted contenders in October, and the selection of the three champions will take place at Halloween. An impartial judge will decide which students are most worthy to compete for the Triwizard Cup, the glory of their school, and 1,000 galleons personal prize money. The house table all erupted on excited whispers, and people turned to their neighbors, whispering fervently about their intentions to join. Even Cass was now wide-eyed with excitement as he stared up at Professor Dumbledore, his reaction to Moody seemingly forgotten. But then Dumbledore spoke again, and the hall quieted once more. Even though I know all of you will be eager to bring the Triwizard Cup to Hogwarts, he said, the heads of the participating schools, along with the Ministry of Magic, had agreed to impose an age restriction on contenders this year. Only students who are of age, that is to say, 17 years or older, will be allowed to put forward their names for consideration. This, Dumbledore raised his voice slightly, for several people had made noises of outrage at these words, is a measure we feel is necessary, given that the tournament tasks will be difficult and dangerous, whatever precautions we take, and it is highly unlikely that students below 6th and 7th year will be able to cope with them. I will personally be ensuring that no underage student hoodwinks our impartial judge into making them Hogwarts champion. I therefore beg you not to waste your time submitting yourself if you are under 17. The delegations from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang will be arriving in October and remaining with us for the greater part this year. I know that you will extend every courtesy to our foreign guests while they are with us, and will give your wholehearted support to the Hogwarts champion when they are selected. And now it is late, and I know how important it is to you all to be alert and rested as you enter your lessons tomorrow morning. Bedtime. Chop chop. Dumbledore sat down again and turned to talk to Mad-Eye Moody. There was a great scraping and banging as all the students got to their feet and swarmed toward the double doors into the entrance hall. "They can't do that," said George Weasley, and Violet turned to see him glaring angrily up at Professor Dumbledore. "We're 17 in April. Why can't we have a shot?" "They're not stopping me entering," said Fred stubbornly, also scowling at the top table. "The champions'll get to do all sorts of stuff you'd never be able to do normally. And 1,000 galleons prize money. Aren't you going to be 17 in October, Cass?" Tracy asked, speaking to Cassius for the first time since getting off the train. She joined Violet by his other side, so the two girls were flanking his towering form. "Yeah," he said, raising an eyebrow. And are you going to put your name forward?" Tracy pressed, struggling to look up at him and navigate the crowd at the same time. Cassius shrugged. "Hadn't given it much thought," he said loftily. "Not that I've had much time to think about it." "Why? Because I don't think you should," Tracy said at once. Cass stopped walking and stared at her. "Why not?" he demanded. "Because people have died," Tracy said in a worried voice. "Seriously, did nobody else hear Dumbledore say there was a death toll?" "He also said they were making it safer this year," said Violet, moving closer to Cass to avoid a swarm of second years coming in their direction. Tracy did not look convinced. "I know, but what does that really mean, Roman 6? Wizards have funny ideas about safety at the best of times." "Ah, yes, because nothing Badver happens to muggles," Cass started. "Definitely no accidents or unforeseen injuries for them." "Oh, stop it," Tracy snapped. "I was only trying to look out for you, you prat." "Come on, Violet." Violet's hand was grabbed, and she found herself being abruptly pulled away from Cassius and toward the staircase leading down into the slithering common room. The door was wide open, as people were steadily filtering in, and Violet was immediately at home. A crackling fire warmed the long, low common room, which was full of high-backed chairs and tables. Tracy pulled Violet all the way down the short staircase to their own dormitory. 5 four-poster beds with silken green hangings stood against the walls, each with its owner's trunk at the foot. Crookshanks meowed in greeting as the girls filtered in, sitting expectantly on Violet's pillow. "Hey there, Crookies," Violet said quietly, leaning down to press a quick kiss to his little orange forehead. "Do you feel like sharing the bed tonight?" Violet and Tracy got into their pajamas and into bed. Warming pans had been placed between the sheets. It was extremely comfortable, and Violet found herself slipping off to sleep within moments. Crookshanks kneaded at the blankets before coming to nestle at her side. Violet smiled into her pillow and felt, with beautiful certainty, that she was at home.